Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works, a podcast for teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, and anyone else who supports teachers in the classroom. This show is a proud member of the BE Podcast Network, shows that help you go beyond education. Find all our shows at bepodcastnetwork.com. I am Gene Tavernetti, the host for this podcast, and my goal for this episode, like all episodes, is that you laugh at least once and that you leave with an actionable idea for better teaching. A quick reminder, no cliches, no buzzwords, only stuff that works. My guest today is Elana Gordon. Elana is a K-6 reading interventionist at Warren Park Elementary School in Cicero, Illinois. She is certified in both letters, Language Essentials for the Teachers of Reading and Spelling, and EBLI, Evidence-Based Literacy Instruction. Elana was a Goyen Fellow in 2023-24, which allowed her to share evidence-based teaching practices through social media. She is the creator of an in-house podcast in her school district called The Road to Reading. The podcast focuses on how teachers are aligning instruction to science of reading and science of learning practices and sharing teacher shifts in instructional practice. In addition, she is the author of several articles published with Edutopia and her Substack, Voices from the Field, which highlights educators and evidence-based practices. Elana is a founding member of Speech to Print Illinois and the soon-to-be IDA Chicago chapter. She is currently a doctoral student at Mount St. Joseph. She is passionate about making sure all children learn to read. She lives in Buffalo Grove, Illinois with her family, and in her spare time, she loves anything outdoors, especially attending summer concerts. I think you're going to like this one. Good morning, Elana. Thank you for being on Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh gosh, I've been looking forward to this. And as I told you before, when we started chatting, I had Pierre Butts on quite a while ago, and he talked about being a Goyen Fellow. And what's a Goyen Fellow? I had no idea. And now you are the fifth Goyen Fellow who has been on this podcast. And the reason is, I mean, all of you are so knowledgeable and so impressive, and I think provide a great service to the rest of the teaching community. In fact, could you just start by talking a little bit about the Goyen Fellowship and the types of things that they do?
Sure. It's a non-for-profit organization. So it's run by the Goyen Foundation, and Kata Salo is the executive director. And one day I was perusing X or Twitter back then, and I saw the advertisement for applying to be a fellow. And I had seen Becky Pallone, which I think she was one of the first educators who did this, who was a fellow. And she had such a huge following and would post videos of her work in her kindergarten classroom. And I just fell in love with the idea of seeing good instruction. And so I was thinking, I'd give it a try. Like, I really wanted to be part of a community of educators that would reflect on their practices. And so that's really what we do. We videotape. We kind of have a direction for our year of what kind of instruction we'll be showcasing. And then we videotape or record lessons or snips of lessons, and we post them. I think that the foundation has become better at this. When I started, I took videos on my phone and posted on X a lot. Now they have a YouTube channel, and I think that's pretty popular. And then, along the way, we write some blogs about our instruction. And these days on Substack, they embed videos so that teachers can actually see what they're describing in action. And I think for me, it's one of the best ways to learn. We would also reconvene. We would convene together once a month, and somebody would lead the meeting on something they were passionate about. And so we would just have an opportunity to learn. And I know you said you had Kair on, and he was in my cohort. So that was like 23, 24. So I learned a lot about fluency instruction from Kair and leadership.
In fact, when we first met, it was at Research Ed in New York City. And, the whole meeting people, air quotes, or somebody call them scare quotes, about meeting people online. It's only partly, you read their posts and you go, oh, these people are great, blah, blah, blah. And I remember, meeting you, and the initial meeting was at, like I say, Research Ed New York City. And you were sitting with Laura Stamm at breakfast. And I remember we introduced ourselves and, oh yeah, I'm Laura, I'm Elana. Okay, great. And then later, towards the end of the day, we met at the where people were selling books. And, you and Laura were trying to decide, what you were going to buy. But in between that time, when we finished the bookstore, in between that time, I realized that Laura was Stam, who I had been, following on Twitter, but it's just hard to make those connections sometime. And so it was very exciting, after to meet you. But the thing that made this memorable is you and Laura were at the little bookstore, and my friend, you were trying to buy a book, and my friend, I was almost embarrassed because he kept picking up my book and handing it to you. You need to read this one. You need to read this one. Is that what your recollection was?
I mean, you're being too hard on yourself. I was there and I really had my eyes set on a Kate Jones retrieval practice book because that's what I was focused on. But they happened to be sold out of that particular book. And then your friend, I think Andrew, right?
Yeah.
He handed us this book and said, "You'll never regret it," or something like that. And I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. I mean, before that breakfast, I don't think I hadn't known about you or your work. But after, and Laura was the one who made us sit there and said, like, look at who we're sitting with. And I was like, okay. And then I think you ended up in a session that we were at too. And then, yeah, I mean, after that day, I went home and I read that book. And there's so many guests that I've had on my podcast that have mentioned your FAST framework. And I know that you were on and you walked us through it. And I haven't regretted it at all. It was one of the highlights. I mean, I put it in my show notes all the time because it's something that I think all teachers, like, I wish I had that book when I had graduated, and gotten my degree. I wish I'd had that right away. I think it centers you on the things that are most important. And so, I mean, even though Andrew was the one who pushed it towards us, I was very grateful that I got a hold of it then because it is one of my favorites.
I wanted to bring that up because I was hoping you would say everything that you just said, all those nice things about it. But also, I think the idea of, we talked about what the Goyen Foundation does and what you do as a Goyen Fellow to help spread the word, but also, being able to meet people at places like Research Ed. I don't know if we talked about this before, but do you have some like favorite experiences or favorite things, favorite ahas or something that you came away from the Research Ed and said, this was really worth it?
I really enjoy just seeing educators that I'd seen or heard about through X. I'd watched them or read some of their Substacks or their blogs, and being able to see them put that into action. I think the session we attended, we went to Zach Rochelle's session, and seeing the amount of opportunities to respond that students had. I think he had us watch a video and we had to count how many times students responded in like a minute. And I actually just presented in Illinois, and I used that same technique because I was in a 45 minutes or a second clip. I mean, those kids had responded over 100 times. And that's just like eye opening to a teacher. Like, look what you can accomplish in such short amounts of time if you're very focused and explicit. So I really appreciated that. We saw Patrice Bain, who is an Illinois educator and has since been on my podcast. So I really appreciated hearing her. There were so many great people that we didn't get to see. I mean, the one's drawback is that everyone presents at the same time. There's different sessions, but there's so many good ones. So I'm hoping to go to the St. Louis Research Ed coming up in September in the fall. So I hope I get a second chance.
All right, great. Well, so you've learned a lot of these techniques. What's something and you have a lot of training, formal training as well, as was mentioned in the introduction. So what are some things that you have started doing in your work as an interventionist, and maybe some things you stopped doing?
Well, so there's kind of like a past and a current. So in the past, like, great, like, I'll say 5 years ago is the past. That's when I really started learning about the science of reading, and then even more recently, learning science. But I came from a balanced literacy district. So we were doing guided reading in small groups and differentiating, or so we thought, and like level text and all those kinds of things. And we really weren't meeting the needs of our students. We weren't, focused on phonics instruction or phonemic awareness. My background actually was in intermediate grades. I was a fifth, sixth grade classroom teacher when I started. And so we really don't learn any of those things when we're in our, education program. And then coming out and just being in the classroom, no one really ever guided us towards the things that mattered. And so I as soon as I heard about the reading science, it just made so much sense. We always knew something was missing. We were missing the mark, but we couldn't quite figure out what exactly it was. And so, being explicit and teaching students how to match, phonemes and graphemes and, put and blend those together and move on from like the basics. So, I mean, those are things that I stopped doing immediately and I started implementing structured literacy practices. Along the way, I learned more about explicit instruction from like Anita Archer and, being very focused and, teaching steps in small incremental ways and checking on student responses, things like that, making sure I'm including and making everyone's thinking visible so I can be responsive. Those are all little things I think that I've changed in the past few years. And then about 2 years ago, I realized that a lot of the practices that I was using were effective. I was seeing student growth like I had never seen before in intervention work, but I felt like it was still not fast enough. Like I work all the way through sixth grade, and my kids were leaving, and they don't have a lot of time left sometimes when they come to you in fifth grade. And so to catch them up several grade levels is a large task. And so I was searching for something that could accelerate growth, not just, give me growth, but accelerate it. And so I stumbled upon speech to print, or linguistic phonics as it's being thrown out there now. And so I got Ebley trained. And there's other ones, Marnie Gisberg has Reading Simplified. Sounds Right is another version. So there are different programs, but I chose Ebley. That's the founder is Nora Chabazi. And I got Ebley trained like 2 years ago and I started implementing it. And there are just some basic principles that are slightly different. Not that everything is different, but we do a lot of work with, integrating all parts of literacy. I do a lot of work more with authentic texts than I do with decodables these days and things like that. And so I have seen a lot of accelerated growth. Last year alone, I think I exited 21 kids out of interventions, which to me was kind of unheard of. I had never seen kids leave interventions before. And there is not really one child out there now that I feel like I can't teach to read, and I can't catch them up to their grade level where they are reading grade level text and can join their class again. Because I think Sean Morrissey is always telling us like there's an opportunity cost there. When those kids come to me, if we don't have that time built into their schedule, they're missing instruction, they're missing content, which is super important as well for knowledge building. And so, it matters how long they're in interventions. And so getting them out as quickly as possible so they can rejoin their classmates and do grade level work is extremely important. And so that's really where my focus has been the last couple of years of trying to refine my practices, learning about speech to print.
Okay, I'm trying to think of all the questions that I want to ask. What's the best order? The one on the top of my head that is most recent, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a teacher, and she's changing grades, and she's going from experienced teacher, been teaching, over 20 years, and I'm in California. And she said, yeah, I've got a new partner, and, she's all into science of reading, and she rolls her eyes. And she rolls her eyes because I've been through this before, and so what do you say to those folks? And you know what? I have a lot of empathy I mean, I've been in education a long time, and this is always the answer. This was always the answer. I remember when we were doing balanced literacy. I remember, all of those things. Now, how do we go to the teachers? How do we move that research to practice, especially in folks that have been through these shifts before? You have any suggestions?
I think the key is not just to be telling people things about the research. I think they have to see it in action, which is one of the things I really appreciate about the Goyen Foundation and other organizations like Step Lab and things that are showing us what that instruction looks like in our classrooms. And they're giving us these opportunities to rehearse it. What does that feel like? What do you say? Like, do you have a script for that? Do you know exactly where you're going to stop and ask a question? I think one of the hardest things for educators is to leave professional learning or development and go back to their classroom. Like they either want to be perfect, so I'm not going to implement it till it's perfect, or they're afraid like tried it wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to look like, and now I'm just done. Like I don't want to continue because it's hard work and it can be messy and it's not always a straight line to from point A to point B. So I think you have to be willing to like jump into the messiness and reflect on your practice. I think recording yourself for the sake of just you watching it is a valuable, skill to learn. I think having a coach work with you is really valuable if you can get that kind of support. And I think that, just having discussions and then finding a topic you're interested in and really learning more deeply about it. Because I hear a lot of times when we go to sessions, oh, I do that. Yes, you do that to some extent, but there's so much nuance to things that you might not have quite thought of. When I started learning this year, I joined a research study from the University of Maryland and we taught reading mastery, which is a direct instruction program, which I had never done before. And just even that sequence of asking a question, the pause and the name sequence at the end, I hadn't really done much of that before. And so having somebody show that to me, and now I can see the value, right? I now get to see the thinking of all students, and then kids have their time to shine, we call it. And I can see the value in that. But without that experience, I might not have stumbled upon that.
I think what you said is very important about being able to see it, because many times, teachers, you're going to believe this. And I don't know, maybe some of the people in my audience, Alana, some teachers are not that excited about having coaches. And one of the reasons that they're not excited about having coaches is they think coaching is going to have somebody's going to come in and tell them, don't do this anymore. And what I found with experienced teachers is that it's usually not a big shift. It's a big shift in their head, maybe,
Yeah.
but what it looks like is not that different. But also, I want to emphasize the point you made about you think you're doing it, about having somebody do it. Because one of the things that we see in education forever, we've watched, is that people mimic things without understanding the underlying, what's going on. And one of the things that I'm worried about, well, I'm not that worried. I don't worry about it, but I'm afraid that what we're going to see is they're going to take a look, everybody's going to take a look at the Mississippi Miracle and say, oh, yeah, well, we have to hold kids back in third grade. And geez, it's not the holding them back. That's not what it is. But that's the
Right.
surface level. That's what we see. Thank you for allowing me to go off here, Alana, a little bit. Well, one of the interesting things that I think, before we started recording, you were talking about that you have done things in your intervention group that they had been effective, but then you found something more effective. Now, and I think just having that self-awareness, could you talk about, like something that you've done that you could think of that fits?
Yeah, sure. I feel like, every scope and sequence in a curriculum, right? You follow it. You're looking for something systematic. We start out simple, we build to more complex. But one thing that I've learned in speech to print is that, I don't have to. I used to use a more structured literacy lesson plan where I would start with phonemic awareness, and then I would go to a phonics piece, and then I would do encoding and decoding, and then I would move to connected text and maybe do some dictation. So it was all kind of step by step. But what I have found is that integration piece, like I might do a little phonemic awareness work outside of my authentic lesson, but every time a student makes says a sound incorrectly, and I say this, and I trade a sound with them and have them reblend, they just substituted, they just reblended. They're using their phonemic awareness in the essence of the active reading. And so by integrating these pieces and not keeping them so isolated, I'm finding that there's an acceleration in that. And I also like another example would be in a scope and sequence. A lot of times we teach silent E, and every couple of days is a new vowel, a new vowel. There's an E at the end with the A, and then E and I. And the thing is, it's the same concept, right? It's when you see that E at the end, it often, you're saying the name of the vowel. So I'm going to teach you the concept behind that, and then I'm going to have you practice it. And of course, thinking about like the instructional hierarchy, I'm going to start with, block practice, and then I'm going to mix it up, and then I'm going to keep moving. But I don't need to spend 2 to 3 weeks teaching you a concept I can teach you in 10 minutes, and then involve all the different vowels and practice. So that piece of practice is so important. And we see it in so many other ways. We see it in musicians, we see it in sports, and yet in education, we don't give enough time to that rehearsal or practice part. And I feel like I've been able to increase the amount of time that students' eyes are on text. And I've really seen that lead to acceleration.
I think what you're describing there is that, like you said, I could teach this in 10 minutes, but we're going to practice it the rest of our lives or the rest of our lives as readers. And so I think that's confusing sometimes for teachers because, okay, we're going to focus on one thing. We're going to do this today. And they say, well, they're not going to learn it today. This is going to take days. Of course, it's going to take days to practice, not to learn it. And it's funny you mentioned the silent E. I've been on it's been years. I've been trying to get people to change the way that they spell cheese because I mean, how many rules about long E do we have to have in one word? We got the silent E at the end, we got the two vowels that go walking. I mean, so I mean, anyway, I can't get people to get on board with that though. So as you're talking, okay, so we've talked about some of the things that you did, but you do better. Is there anything that you've just, I want to get back more to intervention. So how are students identified for intervention where you are?
So we have a universal screener, which was new to our district within the last 5 years. So we give a benchmark test. We use Dibbles 8. And so everyone takes the benchmark, and we have different measures that it includes to kind of give an overall picture. And then we look for students that are like in the bottom, 10% ish. Our system isn't perfect. It's still overloaded in intervention work. We're not quite at where, every grade levels it has kids in the 80%, mark for proficiency. And so we have way too many kids in intervention for all different sorts of reasons. But we look for those kids that are most struggling, who are, in the well below category, bottom 10, 15, 20%. And those are the students that my intervention team picks up. Me personally, I tend to work with students who are very inaccurate, who have low accuracy in their reading and have a low rate of reading. And so what seems to happen with work through EBGLI is that I'm able to increase their accuracy fairly quickly within like a couple months even, so they become very accurate very quickly and speed up that process so that we can think more about fluency and what does that mean and comprehension and things like that.
So do you have multiple interventionists at your site?
Yeah, in my particular school, we have two bilingual interventionists, and we had this past year we had three English interventionists, and it kind of depends on the year how many we have at each building, but it's somewhere around that
So
number.
you supervise these folks. When I say supervise, you provide some support for them.
Not really. Once upon a
Oh,
time,
okay.
I was a coach. I was a literacy coach in my building
Okay.
for
Okay.
10 years, but I don't do that anymore. But I mean,
Okay.
I think being a teacher who's knowledgeable and is thirsty for learning is, can help a team and, think about what it is that we want to focus on. Like, can we make tweaks to our, multi-system, tiered system of support? Can we add things and look at data differently? And so, I mean, I'm always bringing things to my team. I don't
Yeah.
know if I would call
Well,
that what you.
the reason that I asked that question is you mentioned that you had the kids you were working with had a specific thing that you were working on. What was that thing?
Accuracy.
Accuracy. Okay, but so I was wondering if the kids were they do the screener and then well Alana's going to take these kids for accuracy, somebody else is going to take these kids for something else, but that's not what's happening where you are. That's just that's a decision that you made about what you're going to focus on.
Oh, I think we just think about the intervention. So I'm the only EBLI trained interventionist, but we use other programs. So some of us use UFly and some of us use a program from Anita Archer, Phonics for Reading. And so I think it just depends on what we think is a good match for those students. What is it that they're working on? Is it more fluency? Anita Archer's program has like bridging texts. And so they're nice because they move from more decodable types of text to more grade level types of text. And so sometimes teachers will take those interventions will take students who are already accurate who need to work more on their rate of reading and prosody, and so they'll use that intervention. Some other teachers who are not speech to print trained, they'll use UFly.
So do kids move between the groups? Do they graduate?
Sometimes,
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes. I mean, Some students exit, some students after a couple cycles, if we don't see a change, I might say to another interventionist, can you try this student with this intervention because I don't see the progress that we were hoping for to meet their goal. So sometimes there's some changes, but I mean, there's old systems left over. Not everybody is accepting of wanting to give up students. They think of their students as theirs. And so we don't always share nicely. So to speak, but we're working on it.
So are you one of those? You like to keep yours?
No, I like to exit mine. I like to teach them what they need to know. No, I like to get students what they need. So if it's not what I'm giving them, then there's something else out there that matches their need and we need to find it for them. That's our job.
Okay, so you've been an interventionist, you've been a coach for interventionists. So I guess one of my questions is, what are we doing differently now? Or do we have any hangovers? Okay. I know that one of the things that when I was an administrator, I was most disappointed about finding out that many of our interventions looked just like what was happening in the classroom, except there were 4 kids. And it didn't seem like that was the answer to me. And of course, I'm going to stipulate, I'm not an expert in this area, but if we go to an intervention, I would expect something to look different. Doesn't intervention look different in general now? But has the intervention, do we still have hangovers in intervention? We send kids to intervention and it doesn't work. Not in your school, not in your site, but as you hear what people are doing in interventions.
I think that there are lots of students that are stuck in interventions, and we call them lifers. They've been there for as long as you can remember, year after year. And that should tell you something, right? If the instruction isn't working, why is it not changing? I think when you had asked me earlier, what's something that have changed? I think across my teaching years, that realizing that it is my instruction that needs to change and not the student, right? It's never a problem with the student. It's always something in my instruction that needs to be adapted. And so I think that lots of us suffer from that, like we're not, sometimes the instruction does look the same. Sometimes, maybe we're not looking at data close enough. And so we haven't analyzed it to the degree that we need to. And so we're not finding like, what is that, minute struggle that the student is having that we can build on. I do think that the research does point us in the direction of aligning, for MTSS, aligning our instruction. So interventions shouldn't look wildly different, but they should be more intensified. Right. And you can do that in different ways. It can be smaller group size. It could be more opportunities to respond. It could be more models, more explicitness. So I think that it's not the alignment piece, but I think that we need to improve our practice around some of those other pieces that we're still learning.
Is there anything as you continue to learn that you look back on that you were doing and you thought, why did I ever think that was a good idea?
Yeah, I well, first of all, guided reading, and after we moved from we did guided reading using like Fontes and Pinnell's resources and materials, and then we moved to John Richardson's literacy footprints, and we kind of sprinkled some phonics in there. And we used to actually in my district we threw out decodables. We didn't think they were useful. We didn't understand, like you said, we didn't understand the idea behind them. Why, what purpose did they serve? And so we said these stories didn't make sense and we threw them out. And no one told us differently. And so I think that realizing, some of those practices, like kids are not looking at pictures, they're not just guessing at words. They need to know, how the code works, how the system works. But also, we also had units of study by Lucy Calkins, and we taught strategy of the day or the week, like main idea. We would teach it in a text and test it, and then we'd go down to point of view and author's purpose. And we didn't really integrate any of these things. We weren't building knowledge because we were changing topics all the time, and we weren't getting a sense of what kids could or couldn't do. And then I think in terms of writing instruction, we were asking kids to write 5 paragraph essays about topics they could say maybe 3 words about. And so I don't know how you can speak, how you can write before you can even speak about a topic, but learning that, things we needed to teach about cohesion, and we needed to teach about, reference, and we needed to teach about sentence level learning first, and writing and breaking things down for students. Nearly impossible to write a good paragraph if you can't write a good sentence. And so learning how to instruct in that way was something that was a huge change for me. I hadn't ever considered those things before.
It's interesting. You're talking about knowledge building, and what do people call it? The skill of the week is now what you read about it. You read
Yeah.
about it on Twitter. What is, you talk about it, and I'm just shaking my head. Oh yeah, Alana, go for it. What's the tension? What in the world? What's the argument here between the knowledge building and the skills?
Well, I think it's different for experts versus teachers. So I think teachers, like, we adopted core knowledge, or CKLA, and Caminos, and so we have a knowledge building curriculum. But I think a lot of teachers are afraid of the depth of the topics for their students. I also think that the strategies are embedded within the teacher, lessons, but they're not as explicitly stated. So like when you're reading about different civilizations, they're going to ask you to talk about them, and you are comparing and contrasting them. But maybe, you're not just reading a piece that's just on compare and contrast, and this is like what we're focusing on, because you don't, on any given day, you're not focused on that one strategy. A student needs lots of strategies to be able to make their way through a text, and that's what makes them complex. And so, I think that when we focused on just one strategy, we were telling students, like, this is the only thing you do in this text, and that's not accurate. And so I think there's this, I often think on Twitter, though, experts kind of sometimes tell us they seem to disagree, but loudly, but they're not always disagreeing. So like there isn't so much space between them. Like if you really listen or read what they're saying, I feel like they agree on more things than they don't, but they highlight the things that they don't agree on more loudly. And so I think, to me, that's confusing as an educator, because the majority of the average educator doesn't really read enough research. And so we're reliant on, what we think are experts to help us navigate what does the research say. And when you're saying two different things in two different text threads, that's confusing. And so I think that experts, it would be helpful or beneficial for experts to kind of put it all together for us and come to like some consensus before they put that out into the world in front of teachers.
Really a difficult thing for teachers to be able to determine. Again, just because this person has does good work doesn't mean they're not fallible. And I think like you did in your class, well, this is working, but this is better. I found something better. It doesn't negate what somebody has said. It's just that you found some nuance and you made it work. And I'm going to mention Laura Stam here right now, just because I want to mention her in every podcast. But I call Laura the great synthesizer, because
Yeah.
you can see all of these ideas that she has learned, and she makes them fit into her lesson, her personality, her classroom, how she runs her classroom, and you just see them. If you know them, you see them. If you don't know them, you just think, oh, she's a good teacher. But I think that's where the not being bullied into, okay, you have to do it this way. And this is one of the things I always tell teachers, that I ask them, don't do it because I said it, because then if it doesn't work, you're going to blame me. You know,
Yeah.
it has to be yours or you're not going to learn. Alana, what is important, do you think, about the intervention work? What's the most important things in doing this work with
Um,
kids?
I think within your school system, you have to think about alignment. You do have to think about what's going on in your core instruction and how can you help support that, but finding the thing that's going to work for those students. I think that we have to really start the part of the conversation I feel like that is missing out there is that acceleration piece. It's like you said, it's not about what's just working. It's what is working the fastest. And that's what we need to rally behind, right? Kids can't be in interventions forever. They can't be lifers. They're missing valuable instruction in their classrooms, and that's where they should be. And so I think that just understanding, like things like the instructional hierarchy and the amount of practice that students need, and that it's not, yes, you're looking for a level of mastery, but you're also coming back to it time and time again. It's not just like, they learned it and they're never
Right.
revisiting these things. And so, and like you mentioned, I think those are all things that need to be part of the conversation. And I think that acceleration piece to me is the part that's missing the most.
And it's interesting. I think this isn't really part of the learning hierarchy, but I think it's adjacent. And that is, as you work with these kids in intervention and you kind of see what the arc is of improvement. And so you might have kids, there, and it's been 2 weeks. Doesn't look like much improvement to somebody, but they're right on track. And I think that's one of the hard things, not only for interventionists who are just starting to realize, hey, you're making progress, don't give up. But I think it's also important for the classroom teacher to say, oh no, we're not going to get rid of this kid yet. We're not sending them to Elana yet. They're on track. And I think that's part of the operationalizing of high expectations, is understanding there's a path here and they're on it. And I am doing a good job.
Yeah.
We can,
Yes, I think
yeah,
Yeah, I think looking at data helps with that, right? Your data will tell you, like, those celebrations, those moments, even if they're incremental, like, you don't
yeah,
get from point A to point B. You don't take this big flying leap, right? It's steps
yeah.
along the way, and you have to acknowledge and plan for those too.
And with a lot of those kids, there is that flying leap as you exit them. And then they're good. They're good to go. Well, Alana, do you have any questions for me before we go?
Of course I do. I love questions. Well, I
Oh
know that.
gosh, we didn't talk about your podcast. Oh my goodness, we'll talk about it in a second.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
no worries. So I know that you've worked in a lot of schools and you've coached with a lot of teachers. And so I'd be interested in like thinking about systems work. I wanted to know, what are like 3 to 5 actionable steps that you would put in place in a school or tell leadership to put in place to get there to kind of turn a building around?
Well, I know you didn't ask this question to get this response, but we do have a new book out. I co-authored a book called Digital Captives. And it's pretty much about that, about developing systems that to turn buildings around. I mean, the focus of this was initially about technology, but it's about just turning the school around, systems that need to be in place. But one of the things that is most important is that there is a common language around instruction. You don't have to say, it's interesting. A lot of, I talked to Zach, and he's worked with places. He's worked, like, you'll see these folks in New York talk about the work they've done. Like, he was at a school where or the school district that they had the Cyclone 6, and that they didn't say, teachers, you have to use the FAST framework, but we want to see these elements in instruction. And other schools have done, I can't remember, they come up with some wonderful alliterative way to describe all these good things that should be in instruction and to talk about them with a similar way. One of the things, as you talked about earlier, opportunities to respond. Whatever those things are, it has to be agreed upon that these are good things, and that we're all going to do them. If you don't have that, everything is just somebody's opinion. So you have to start with that. And we've seen just a lot of success, doing that. In fact, I remember being on your podcast and you asked me about, the FAST framework and how it relates to like the scripted programs or semi-scripted programs. And I thought, I think they're great. I think what happens if you understand the explicit instruction, like in the FAST framework, you see why these other programs work. I mean, there's total alignment. So we're not asking you to do another thing. We're just bringing this to attention. That is one of the biggest things, just an agreement about who we are here at this school, a common language, and then having somebody to help you do that. That's why we have coaches now. It's not to say you're a bad teacher. It's to help you so that you're actually getting results from the things that we're asking you to do, because we do know that they work. But it's hard to know what those points of leverage are. What are the most important parts of this? So common vocabulary, common lesson structure, to be able to talk about that, to be able to coach to get better, and always with the goal in your instructional hierarchy is not so that teachers are robots. It's to get past the fluency and that you're making those decisions, you're making generalizations and adaptations, as you're teaching.
Okay, I'm going to bring those back to my leadership. I'm going to say that Jean signed off on all of these things.
Send them the book. Bring them the book. All right. Elana, okay, before we go, tell us, there's two things we want to talk about. Number one, tell us about your podcast.
Oh, yes. So my podcast is called The Road to Reading. And I started it as a way to support my colleagues as we were making these shifts together. And then along the way, we've asked some experts to be on it, like yourself, and you've given us kind of some good things to think about. And then I also speak to lots of educators who are putting these practices or strategies into their real life classrooms and showcasing what that looks like. And so I try to match the podcast to the professional learning that my district is doing for the year. And it just so happens that everybody gets to benefit.
Oh, great, great. So you've got your podcast, you've got your Substack, which will be in the notes. And the Substack, as you mentioned, a lot of the videos will show up now in the Substack.
Yeah, that's a great feature. Can
Okay.
I mention one more thing coming up?
I hope it's what you're doing with Holly.
Yes, it just came out in the bell ringer this morning. It was so
Yes.
exciting to see. Yes. So Holly Corby from the Bell Ringer and Kata Salo and the Goyen Foundation, which is also the Science of Reading Classroom, and myself, which my Substack is called Voices from the Field. We are co-sponsoring a virtual symposium June 30th in the afternoon hours. It's like about a half a day. And we are accepting proposals. It just went live. We're accepting proposals from educators that have had great student outcomes and would like to share how they got those outcomes with other educators. And we're looking for practical strategies that teachers can implement in their practice, like the next day. And we are so excited to highlight teachers and build a community of learners together. And so please check out the save the date and please attend. And I hope everyone will submit a proposal.
You know what? Oh, I know that this will be out in time for the event for sure. What are the proposals? What are you asking that the proposals be in?
I believe it's like early May, I want to say. I can't quite remember the date, but I think it's early May that the deadline says.
All right, we'll be able to have that by then. Anything else, Elana, that we should be sharing that you'd like to share?
No, I just so appreciate joining you today to talk, and it's always nice to hear from you.
Oh, Elana, the same. Thank you so much and hope to see you. Well, I think we'll see you in St. Louis.
Oh, yes.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
If you're enjoying these podcasts, tell a friend. Also, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can follow me on Blue Sky at G Tavernetti, on Twitter, X, at G Tavernetti, and you can learn more about me and the work I do at my website, tesscg.com. That's TESSCG.com, where you will also find information about ordering my books, Teach Fast, Focused, Adaptable, Structured Teaching, and maximizing the impact of coaching cycles.